And thanks again for the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. Everyone will see later in the presentation that we do try to seek out opportunities like this to provide outreach and engage with different groups of stakeholders to raise awareness of our regulations, but also to increase compliance. And so this is a golden opportunity for us, so thank you. So we'll jump into it. The Marine Invasive Species Program in California is a multi-agency program. Many of you know that I'm with the California State Lands Commission, but there's actually 4 different agencies in total in California that make up the Marine Invasive Species Program. And together we work towards reducing the likelihood of non-indigenous species introductions into California's waters, and we do that by regulating the management of both ballast water and biofouling. So one question we get a lot is, why even regulate biofouling? So in California, we, over 20 years ago, made the commitment to try to reduce the introduction of non-indigenous species from shipping activities through our regulation of ballast water management. And biofouling is just another part of that puzzle. We know that ships coming into California have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of organisms associated with their underwater surfaces. We know from research that we've funded and collaborated on that most of those organisms are likely to be alive and reproductively capable. And we know that over 60 or up to 60% of the currently established non-indigenous species in California's coastal and estuarine waters were likely introduced through biofouling. So it's an important issue for us, and one that our state legislature told us that put a priority on for us to be able to develop and adopt these regulations. So I want to run through a quick timeline of the activities we went through prior to the development or prior to the adoption of the regulations. And it started in 2005 when we convened a technical advisory group for a series of 4 meetings to discuss the risks from biofouling to California, what the shipping industry was already doing to manage some of those risks. And we took all that information, put it into a legislative report that we provided to the California State Legislature in 2006, identifying the problem, making recommendations, highlighting information gaps. The legislature the following year adopted legislation that placed a mandate on our program to develop and adopt these regulations, and they asked us to fill in some of those information gaps that we had identified. So we, starting in 2006, we started funding targeted biological research to give us some answers at some of the patterns of biofouling that we might expect on different types of ships. So we started that in 2006 and continued to the present day. In 2008, we started to collect on a mandatory basis information from every vessel coming into California on their maintenance and operational practices that relate to biofouling. And we collect that on an annual basis. So we get annual snapshots of the activities of the fleet, and that dates back to 2008. We took all of that information and reconvened our technical advisory group, and this time expanded it a bit more, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. But with this technical advisory group, we tried to synthesize all of this information that was coming from the different data streams, try to take advantage of different research and policies that were being developed elsewhere. And through that process, we developed a set of proposed regulations that we released to the public in 2012. So that was our first public rulemaking action. So we released a set of proposed regulations, accepted comments from the public, made revisions, released another draft, accepted comments, made revisions, released another draft. So we did that 3 times and then ran into the 1-year deadline in California to complete a rulemaking action. So we pulled it back, talked again for the next couple of years with our technical advisory group, and then released a second public rulemaking action in 2015. And again, went through 3 rounds of public drafts and comments, released the third rulemaking action in 2016. And during that rulemaking action, we had 2 versions of the proposed regulations that were in the public realm before we finalized and took them to our commissioners for approval. And so our commissioners, the state land commissioners, approved them in April 2017, and they became effective later that year in October. So just to quickly summarize that timeline, we took 10 years from when we received our mandate from our California State Legislature to when we adopted the regulations. And during that time, we relied on over 9 years of vessel maintenance and operational practices that we collected with that annual hull husbandry reporting form. That gave us information on industry baselines, management gaps and behaviors of the different ships that were coming into California. We paired that with 10 years of scientific research, giving us clues to patterns among ships and ship types and different ship surfaces, brought all that information into our technical advisory group process and deliberated with that group, and then went to the public. And through public engagement, we had 3 different rulemaking actions with 8 different public drafts that the public was able to comment on before we settled on the final regulations. And so just a quick word on that technical advisory group collaboration, and we expanded it in 2010. And we had a lot of participation and great participation from everyone that was involved. The industry members not only included ship owners and operators and trade groups, but dry docking representatives, in-water cleaning companies, anti-fouling coating manufacturers and trade groups, marine growth prevention system manufacturers. We also expanded the local, national, and international agencies, regulatory agencies that we worked with. And I do want to say that we worked very, very closely with our colleagues in New Zealand and Australia who were going through the same process at the same time. And so we tried to maintain as much consistency between our policies as possible. And then we expanded the list of scientists that we relied on to kind of synthesize all the current science. And that included a lot of folks that were interested and experts in bioinvasions and biofouling in particular. So I mentioned that the regulations went into effect in October of 2017, but we phased in implementation of most of the requirements based on the vessel's dry docking schedule. So most of the requirements are effective for ships when they, after the first regularly scheduled dry docking or delivery on or after January 1st, 2018. So it didn't go into effect for every vessel at the same time. And we phased it in this way because we felt effective biofouling management is dependent on the types of preventive practices that are best implemented when the ship is in dry dock. So I want to spend the next few slides talking about the different components of our regulations. First, there's a requirement for every vessel that is subject to these regulations to have a biofouling management plan and a biofouling record book. These need to be consistent with the IMO biofouling management plan that's included in the biofouling guidelines at IMO. They need to be vessel specific, need to be current as of the most recent out of water maintenance or delivery. And it needs to describe the effective lifespan of any coating that is used on the vessel, and also the niche area management actions for all niche areas, but we specified 8 in particular that we will be looking for. We want to see management actions for those areas and how biofouling is being managed in them. But we knew that because this was a new regulatory regime and there weren't any other jurisdictions out there that had mandatory biofouling management regulations like this, that there would be a steep learning curve. And we didn't want to start penalizing vessels and vessel owners because they may have been unaware of the requirements. So we included a 60-day grace period provision that works like if a vessel comes into California and is subject to the requirements and we inspect and we notice a deficiency in their biofouling management plan, rather than penalizing them right off the bat, we will issue a 60-day grace period and say, the vessel owner, you have 60 days to correct the deficiency. And once you come back into California after the expiration of that 60 days, we'll go back on board, conduct another inspection, and determine whether or not that deficiency was fixed. And if so, the vessel is compliant. And if they haven't fixed that deficiency after the 60 days, then we will issue a notice of violation. And again, this was intended to ease the transition into this new regulatory regime and ultimately to raise awareness of the requirements and to encourage compliance. We also require an annual vessel reporting form. This is very similar to the hull husbandry reporting form that we've been collecting since 2008. But this annual reporting form is to be submitted 24 hours prior to the vessel's first California arrival of each calendar year. And because it's similar to our previous hull husbandry form, it helps us to continue building onto our data set that we have now 12 years of ship maintenance and operational practices in that data set. So it helps to build on that, But because we also get this 24 hours in advance now of the first arrival, we can conduct pre-arrival risk-based prioritization to make sure that we are going out and inspecting the vessels that are present the highest perceived risk to us. We have biofouling management requirements that are based on best practices, and pretty simply, they include if the vessel is using an anti-fouling coating, that we expect the coating to not be aged beyond its effective lifespan. So for example, if the coating is applied at a thickness and scheme that is designed for 36 months, we would expect the vessel to not go beyond that 36 months. And if they do, then they need to document in their biofouling management plan how they will manage biofouling in the absence of an effective coating. We also require specific descriptions for how the vessel will manage biofouling in their niche areas, and 8 specific ones that we've highlighted that include sea chests, sea chest gratings, thrusters, thruster gratings, rudders, propellers, stabilizers, and out-of-water support strips or dock blocks. And of course, those actions need to be followed up in the record book. We have provision for vessels that spend 45 days or longer in the same location. These are categorized as extended residency periods. And vessels are expected to manage biofouling consistent with how they've described in their biofouling management plan. And of course, they have to follow up in their record book as well. And then we have a few other components that provide blueprints for how to petition for alternative or emergency exemptions if the situation warrants. So those are the main categories of the different provisions within the regulations. I want to spend the next couple of slides talking about our outreach strategies. So we produced a guidance document prior to the implementation in October of 2017 that is available on our website. It explains the regulations in plain English, so non-regulatory speak, because if you look at the regulations themselves, it's not the clearest. So we provided a clear English version here with a frequently asked questions section, and then we provide a template for an effective biofouling management plan. We also conducted a few webinars, so one before the implementation, so this was in September of 2017, that again described the regulations in plain English, and we had a question and answer session at the end of that. That's posted at the website you see there. We followed that up a year later with another webinar based on the information we were getting from our marine safety specialists who were conducting inspections on common deficiencies in areas where we felt we had to improve clarity. So we produced that other webinar that's on the bottom. That was in fall of 2018, and again, that's on our YouTube channel. And then before the implementation, we also held a series of customer service meetings in Northern and Southern California to, again, describe the regulations, take questions from the audience. And in this case, most of the audience members were shipping agents throughout California that deal directly with the ships when they come in. And then we tried to take advantage of it as many conferences and opportunities like this one to provide outreach and raise awareness and take questions to try to make sure that everyone is aware of what we require in California so that we can help the industry to improve compliance and improve their biofouling management. We also developed a series of information sheets that our marine safety specialists take on board when they conduct inspections. So they discuss these with the vessel's crews, and they describe the biofouling management requirements, reporting requirements, record-keeping requirements, and give guidance for how to manage biofouling in different areas of the ship. These are also available on our website. So when we go on board and do inspections, our marine safety specialists are looking at the biofouling management plan. They're looking at the biofouling record book. They're looking to make sure that these meet the requirements, that they're ship specific, that they describe the effective coating lifespan of any anti-fouling coating that's being used, that they accurately or completely describe their niche area management. And we get a lot of questions about what have we observed, how many grace periods have we issued, and for us, like, we wanted to know how big is the learning curve. So these data here represent the first year of inspections. So I mentioned that the phased-in implementation started on January 1 of 2018, and only when a vessel comes out of dry dock after that date will they be subject to our regulations. And so in January, we saw a relatively small amount of vessels coming in that were subject to these regulations, and every month since then, that number has continued to climb. So we started our actual inspections in August of 2018. So this first year represents August 2018 through July 2019. So during that 12-year period, we saw about 11,000 vessel arrivals in California, and about a quarter of them were subject to these requirements. So 2,515 arrivals during the first year were subject to the regulations, and that's shown by this first pie chart. We inspected 20% of those vessels. So we targeted the first arrival since the vessel becomes subject to these requirements. So our goal was to go out the first time they come into California and conduct the outreach, do the inspection, but let them know what the requirements were, issue a grace period if necessary. But we want to make sure that the vessels coming into California are aware of what the requirements are. And so if you look at the second pie chart, that represents the 20% of all of the subject arrivals. So that's 505 inspections that we've conducted. 60% of them were compliant, which means we had to issue grace periods for 40% of those inspections. If we go to the third chart, that's that 40%. So we had 202 grace periods that were issued. During that first year, 87 of those ships came back after the expiration of the grace period, and all but 3 had fixed that deficiency. And so only 3 out of those 202 grace period that we issued, and actually out of the 505 inspections, only 3 were non-compliant and were issued notice of violation. So those grace periods, those 202 grace periods that we issued, over a third of them were for multiple deficiencies. So it could have been missing a few things from the management plan, one thing from the management plan and the record book, but I think that told us that there still was some work to be done to ensure that the industry was aware of what the requirements were. As far as specific reasons for the grace periods being issued, 72% of the grace periods were because the vessel did not describe the expected coating lifespan in the biofouling management plan. 22% of them were for incomplete niche area management descriptions, and most of those were because the out-of-water support strips or dock block areas weren't properly described, or their management actions weren't properly described. So what have we learned through all this? I think first and foremost, and it's not very surprising, but perhaps it was underappreciated, I guess. We're dealing with a different paradigm than with ballast water. So with ballast water, the vessel's crews are responsible for the management actions. So if there's non-compliance, it's because perhaps the exchange was conducted at an area that wasn't appropriate, or the vessel crew didn't use the ballast water treatment system appropriately. But the actions are usually the result of what's going on the vessel, whereas with biofouling, especially when we're looking at biofouling management plans, any deficiencies in those aren't necessarily the fault of the crew member. A lot of those plans are being developed by the owner, management groups, operations departments. And so when we're on board discussing these issues with the vessel's crew, we have to have different messages for the crew. We also send the 60-day grace period letters to the vessel's owners and management groups so that they're aware of what the deficiencies are and how to correct it. And so for us, it was a lesson to ensure that we're having those conversations with the appropriate groups and tailoring the talking points to the appropriate group. What else have we learned? So we knew that there would be learning curves, and we're experiencing that, learning curves for all parties. That 60-day grace period provision that we implemented was designed to flatten that curve, that learning curve. We've seen that these grace periods are working effectively, that of those 202 that we issued in the first year, and 87 of them came back in, only 3 were still non-compliant. So that's good news for us, telling us that that approach is raising awareness and ultimately raising compliance. We have noticed that there are a lot of generic biofouling management plans out there that aren't necessarily vessel specific. So in the sense that it'll have a vessel's name and their ship particulars, it's specific to that vessel, but the rest of the document is fairly generic and basically the same across the an ownership group's fleet, and doesn't necessarily meet the intent. We've also seen that the different management actions for niche areas may say that they will inspect and clean as necessary, but terminology like that doesn't really tell us what they will do and doesn't really communicate to the vessel's crew what they need to do to manage biofouling in those areas. So when should they inspect? And during the inspection, what would trigger action, and to what degree does that action take? So none of that information is clearly laid out. So that's one area where we would like to see, and we'll still continue doing this outreach to try to communicate that we want to see more descriptive management actions in these management plans. In communication with our marine safety specialists who are doing inspections, we found that there is, at least with the crews that they're interacting with, limited knowledge about the risks related to out-of-water support strips or dock block areas, and niche areas in general. So that's another area where we're trying to communicate a little bit better and raise awareness as well. And then we found that effective coating lifespan information is more readily available today than it was 2 years ago when the regulations first went into effect, and a lot more prevalent than they were 2 years before that when we were still developing these regulations. So that's a positive sign that that information about the ship-specific application and scheme for that anti-fouling coating is available and put into these management plans. So last slide, the next steps. So we will continue conducting outreach and engagement as often as we can. So again, opportunities like this through the GloFouling partnerships are golden for us to help us get that information out and interact with different groups of stakeholders. So I'm looking forward to the question and answer period here. We hope to implement, we will be implementing a risk-based vessel prioritization assessment later on this summer. So right now, I believe I mentioned that we are targeting every vessel that's subject to the biofouling regulations on their first arrival, since they became subject to these regulations. But as more and more vessels fall under the jurisdiction of these regulations, that won't be sustainable. So we're going to be switching to a risk-based prioritization based on the annual vessel reporting form data that comes to us. So we will better target our inspection resources toward the vessels that are presenting the greatest perceived risk. And we hope to pair that with ROV surveys later to try to validate and revise as necessary. We're working on a joint article with our colleagues at the New Zealand Ministry for Primary Industries right now to talk about the compliance trends and the lessons that we both learned from the first year of enforcement of our respective regulations. We both started regulating biofouling within a few months. And so over the same time period, we were experiencing different things, some of the same things. And so we're trying to synthesize that into a paper to be able to provide that information to others that are going to be regulating biofouling at some point. And then finally, we will spend part of this year revising our existing enforcement regulations to merge the biofouling requirements into them to be able to establish specific penalties associated with violations for different types of violations, so that we can be as transparent as possible about what the penalty will be if you violate A, B, or C. And that's it.